Mr. Hoffa, Robert Kennedy testified today at the first McClellan Committee hearings on the Cosa Nostra. He called for a broader wiretap law.
That's why he had a murderer, a dope peddler, on the witness stand. So he can push through a wiretap, so he can have a greater police state than he's already has in this country for a wiretapping. If I want to talk to my wife, my daughter, or my son, or anybody else, I don't need somebody spying on me, and I'm sure everybody in this country feels the same way.
Are you questioning the legitimacy of these McClellan Committee hearings?
I say that it's nothing more or less than the McClellan Committee hearings to be held to try and again get public sentiment, excitement, to put through a wiretap bill that would be the first step towards a further greater police state in this country.
Welcome back, listeners. Welcome to A People's History of Violence, the podcast where we do deep dives in history's assassinations, affairs, crimes, coups, conspiracies, cover-ups, terrors, and trials. I'm your co-host, Isaac.
I'm your co-host, Peter.
What are we doing today, Peter?
We're back. We're back to Jimmy. We're back not Meshuggah Uncle Jimmy, Jimmy Hoffa.
Yes.
The big... Did he ever have a nickname? Did they call him like Jimmy Trucks? The Big Cheese?
I mean, Hoffa is so just straightforwardly easy.
Iconic.
Hoffa, that I think it just stuck with Hoffa.
It's just Hoffa. Got it.
But yeah, when we left off with non-Meshuggah Uncle Jimmy, with Big Jim Hoffa, we had left off in the 1950s and we touched somewhat on the 1960s, and we did a kind of like flyover view of what the empire of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters looked like in all of its different progressive tendencies and reactionary tendencies, and Hoffa's own role in trying to really bring these kind of different tendencies pulling apart together. But today, we're going to talk about a nonstop, quasi-terroristic legal campaign to put Hoffa in prison. To identify him as the bad guy, the source of all evil, the enemy within, as Robert F. Kennedy said, and put him in prison, and why they wanted to put him in prison so much. When we left off,
not just get him not in charge of the Teamsters anymore,
right? Although they tried that multiple times.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they tried putting Teamsters into trusteeship, and they thought that they could kind of put thumb on the scale. The federal government, put the thumb on the scales with the election, that he wouldn't get elected. Instead, he got elected with a massive majority, including when it was under trusteeship and under like legal observers and all of that. They tried to make sure he wouldn't be elected. They kicked the Teamsters out of the AFL-CIO. That didn't do the trick because he was extremely beloved by the constituent workers because he delivered the goods. And he had no qualms about using strikes and the threat of strikes and force to get that. But as we said on the last episode, the Kennedy brothers, and this is usually presented as kind of like a personal vendetta, especially above Robert Kennedy, a kind of buttoned up, moralistic, Boy Scout good guy against a sleazy, amoral, does anything it takes to get the goods bad guy. And really, I think we peel back a layer with the last episode to show that Robert F. Kennedy, primarily in part due to his ambitions and, I'm sure personal animosity went into it, and feeling like he was the good guy prosecutor, was really just the face of a joint effort by anti-labor and just bastard Jim Crow congressmen and senators to neutralize the power of the Teamsters Union, which was a political power and it was an economic power. And that power continued to increase throughout these legal campaigns against Hoffa. Should probably take a moment, of course, to acknowledge some of our sources on this episode, which is a sprawling episode. Buckle up, listeners. We might even have to split it into two parts here. My sources were a incredibly good and just readable essay called The Hoffa Trial by Fred J. Cook, a legal commentator and writer who loved doing these kind of political intrigue type cases for The Nation magazine from 1964. Kennedy Justice by the late great Victor Navasky, one-time editor of The Nation magazine, and the review of Kennedy Justice by Michael the Tiger in the New York Review of Books, and a incredible and much newer book, The Rise and Fall of Nashville Lawyer Tommy Osborne by William Tabak, as well as, of course, The Trials of Jimmy Hoffa by you-know-who, Jimmy Hoffa.
Yeah.
And a ton of newspaper archives and court opinions, including Hoffa v. U.S. and the dissenting opinion written by Justice William Brennan.
Yep, we went to the archives, folks. Or by we, I mean I said. I might be the officially trained historian, but that's, you know.
I'm the gopher.
Yeah, that's right.
So how did Hoffa get taken down? How did he get put in prison? Because if you don't know how he got put in prison, you don't know why it mattered that he got out and was such a dangerous force to get out.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take everyone back a little bit, back in time, for another overview segment. The year is 1960. Jimmy Hoffa is master of America's transportation system. Courtrooms are battlefields. Cue Napoleon.
Yeah.
At least that's the caption that's playing over the heads, you know, of Bobby Kennedy and anti-labor Jim Crow senators who are backing him in the next 6 years in their vendetta of trials, investigations, and some really nefarious stuff against Jimmy Hoffa. So this episode is going to be about how at the height of his power, and this was the absolute height of Hoffa's power, he came under the most relentless assault using courtroom law, indictments, grand juries, investigations of any labor leader I am aware of. Short of just pulling out the stakes and having him killed, hint for later, this is the most force of the state I have seen bear against one labor leader.
If it weren't specifically forbidden in the Constitution, maybe they would have done a bill of attainder.
Yeah, that's basically where they're at. But this is not a clean story, as I said, of do-gooder prosecutors and corrupt union bureaucrats either. It is an absolute labyrinth of frankly scary Elroy-esque mercenary spies and counter spies, blasting cigarettes with reels of tape recording in the background, wiremen tapping and finding taps of other people, slack-jawed, racist, crooked cops doing extortion for the government, a pedophile double agent who gets investigated for maybe having a hand in the Kennedy assassination, and smiling, well-paid members of the bar, lawyers.
Yeah.
Standing astride the entire labyrinthine mess.
Yeah, we're used to in crime dramas, the lawyer, unless it's specifically a courtroom drama, lawyers being like ancillary to the main action, right? It's the cops, it's the criminals. But people, I think, often don't appreciate how important lawyers are to the ongoing action. Yeah,
and in this case, they're like commanders standing astride an army of goons and wiremen.
Yeah.
So let's go back a sec, shall we? So where we left off partly was Hoffa in the late 50s and early 60s. He's best friends with, as some call them, backsliding socialist Harold Gibbons. Frankly, still socialist Harold Gibbons. And they're roommates in Washington, D.C. Hoffa operates out of a big, fat Teamsters building called the Marble Palace, which is supposed to be so grand to literally impress congressmen with like the Teamsters are to be taken seriously.
Yes.
We're not some guys just hanging out in the local that you can come in and come out. You come to the Marble Palace and you ask for our support. But Harold Gibbons and Hoffa are roommates in an apartment in Washington. There's actually even I think it was a Time magazine profile of them where like Bert and Ernie in like bathrobes, they're like standing around their apartment having tea because Hoffa doesn't do coffee and hanging out.
Doesn't want to be overstimulated.
Yeah. And needless to say, of course, that bothers a lot of the right-wing establishment in Washington, particularly these Jim Crow senators, because Hoffa's apparently closest buddy, his Ernie to Hoffa's Bert, is this like ex-Trotskyist, like rabble-rouser in St. Louis who wants to build a social democratic United States.
So do we know whether they were, whether he was a good roommate?
He seems to have been a good roommate, but they had strained relations as time went on because Harold Gibbons, him and Hoffa see eye to eye on the priorities of the Teamsters Union. And Hoffa loves using Harold Gibbons as like also like a polite and nice and intellectual face to go to places like Europe and you know, California to go deal with those hoity-toity people.
Right.
But Harold Gibbons doesn't really just do what Hoffa says, unlike a lot of more corrupt Hoffa flunkies who are happy to just say the words and nod the nods in order to get Hoffa's approval and favor. So they do have strained relations as time goes on. He's like the person that Hoffa trusts, but often doesn't like because he doesn't just bow down to Hoffa. Interestingly, this time Hoffa also gets someone who the congressional committees, the McClellan Committee in particular, really identify as a dangerous character named Edward Chaffetz. He became a special advisor, as the title was, to Hoffa during this time. He was a labor organizer who became a labor organizer after a trip in 1933 to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union. And when he came back, joined the CIO, and became close with John Lewis, the head of the CIO, and even named his son John Lewis Chaffetz.
Oh, wow.
He joined the Communist Party and then like left at some point when it became like too much heat to do that.
Yeah.
But in spite of the fact that, you know, Communist Party members and one-time Communist Party members were pretty much
left and right.
Yeah, we're getting blacklisted left and right. This guy had no problem just getting a job as a special advisor to Hoffa.
Interesting.
So Hoffa's continued the continued racketeer communist alliance goes on with Hoffa, and this freaks out the senators. They even issue a report in 1958, which I'll get to. But this guy Chaffetz, he becomes an industrial relations consultant, and he joins the law firm of one Edward Bennett Williams.
Okay.
And I get my eyes even glaze over as a lawyer when I talk up different lawyers, or they're seen as like titans. But Edward Bennett Williams was the man. He really, if you were being prosecuted for some kind of political crime or serious high scandal, particularly in Washington, D.C., or if you needed something taken up to the Supreme Court, Edward Bennett Williams was the guy. He could turn a case entirely on its head, and not in some kind of slick talking Texas lawyer like Percy Foreman, Racehorse Haynes way, or Bob Durst's lawyer in the Jinx, who's just like, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
Edward Bennett Williams had that calm, cool, intellectual way of gently explaining to someone that this is the reality of what happened, and to the point where you just can't doubt anymore. And he loved recruiting into his firm red lawyers who were pretty much blacklisted from other places.
Interesting.
One of Edward Bennett Williams's greatest disciples or greatest students was Michael Tiger.
Wow.
Who later becomes attorney for Angela Davis, becomes the attorney when practically no one else wanted the job of Terry Nichols, and practically walked him out.
Wow.
And is the author of a great slim volume called Law and the Rise of Capitalism, because Michael Tiger was an open Marxist the whole time. He was originally going to get a Supreme Court job, but the FBI investigated his background.
You've got to figure a guy like this, hiring all these lawyers and giving them the chance to do the kind of law that they'd be interested in, would have fierce loyalty from these people and get the best work.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
So, Edward Bennett Williams, liberal-ish guy with a lot of conservative friends, but he ran a shop full of reds, as Congress would see it.
Yeah.
And he was also Hoffa's preferred lawyer and law firm.
Interesting.
On the same principle.
Yeah. So
the thing that Hoffa does to really raise eyebrows, and I think is the thing that set in motion many of these prosecutions, because with most of these prosecutions, they're either stings, setups, or they're combing through massive amounts of records to try to find something that Hoffa did wrong. And Hoffa is a very careful person because he both doesn't want to get caught, and he has enough money and power to be able to get legal consultants to know exactly the line you go up to and not cross.
Yeah, he's an experienced player of the game. He knows It's like how, apparently, I don't really know sports that well, but apparently there are just some positions in team sports where part of it is just knowing how to cheat in a way that you won't screw over your team.
Right. So the thing I've been leading up to is Hoffa tries to make a deal with other some of the very radical trade union leaders to effectively have a council that would control all U.S. transportation and would be able to demand whatever rates or benefits they wanted. He made a deal specifically with Harry Bridges at this time in 1958. Harry Bridges was the Australian-born leader of the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Workers Union and was an open class struggle Marxist and widely alleged member of the Communist Party. He was at least a fellow traveler. And I know there's a great biography that came out recently of him, which I have to read. And we probably should do an article on Harry Bridges because next to Hoffa, Harry Bridges probably gets like the runner-up award for the most politically motivated prosecutions at deportation hearings. I think there were like 5 or 6 different prosecutions of Harry Bridges for supposedly like lying on some immigration form or something.
And they could deport him because he was from Australia,
right?
And they couldn't deport Hoffa because he's from America.
He's from the U.S. of A.
Yeah, I'm sure they would have loved to try.
So RFK, beloved of liberals, really tried to tar Hoffa with his relationship with Harry Bridges. He questioned him about it repeatedly at the McClellan Committee hearings. And Hoffa was trying to form an agreement with Harry Bridges as well as the members of the National Maritime Union, the International Longshoremen's Association, to basically bring every single bit of cargo from when it arrives in a port in San Francisco to when it gets unloaded, to when it gets transported off to St. Louis, to when it gets transported up to New York and unloaded in another warehouse in New York, every single step of the way being done by members of this conference of transportation workers, so that at no time could there be a worker who wasn't represented by a union, had a shop steward, had rights, and had the ability to really strike and bring the boss to a heel. It's a pretty amazing thing. On his end, he was also hoping to use this leverage, this power, to fulfill kind of his dream, which is to get a national master freight agreement where every single trucker in the United States has a wage rate that's spelled out, kind of like a constitution for truckers and freight unloaders and everything, regardless of whether they were in like Montgomery, Alabama, or in a high wage place like Seattle. One of the kind of vulnerabilities of Hoffa and his union, though, was in the midst of all of this prosperity, as they're racking up collective bargaining agreements and so on, tons of money is going into their pension fund. Now, the pension fund has like different regional pension funds. The really big one is called the Central States Pension Fund, CSPF. And this fund is supposed to be run by a kind of a joint council of management and labor. So there's like a whole set of like lawyers and industry leaders. I think there's like 12 of them on each side who are supposed to be on one side representing management and have been nominated as part of like a collective bargaining agreement with all of these trucking companies. Right.
And because the managers, well, go ahead with the description.
Well, every one of these bosses who pays like some into the fund as part of the union agreements, they want some kind of like representation at the table as to how the fund's money was invested. They have half of the standing committee that runs that. IBT people, Teamsters, have the other half. And how it's supposed to be run is essentially like they're supposed to hire on professional managers who invested to get X amount return, Y amount of return, in order that Teamsters have a nice pension at retirement. At this time, it's actually like fairly low. And it widely varies as to like whether your pension is being properly dispersed, if you're in like, say, like Anthony Provenzano's local in New Jersey, as opposed to like a really nice clean local like Harold Gibbons is, or Hoffa's own local of Local 299 in Detroit. How it's actually run, according to the examination that was done by these 2 Harvard professors who kind of went around with Hoffa, is it was kind of a mess. all kinds of people, swindlers and random company guys and people trying to open up like roadside hotels and so on would just approach Hoffa and other members of the board with their ideas and be like, you guys should invest in this. And the pension fund as a result became kind of like a shadow investment bank that, and it gets characterized as like, you know, they were doing payoffs and there was lots of corruption. And there's no doubt that in some way, Hoffa and these other guys were like taking a cut off these investments some way. Like that happened for sure. Probably like a payoff to get approval for the loan. But the strange thing about it is that this pension fund did get a lot of money from its investment, partly because like Hoffa knew like what industries were growing because he had all these truckers.
Control over the trucking.
Yeah. So he like his trucker, like some of their first investments were in like roadside hotels, roadside amusement, roadside
Malls
food
and stuff,
and
right?
malls.
In Florida, right?
And Florida, like Hoffa thought Florida was going to blow up. And all of these are correct.
Yeah.
But most of these people who were like pitching these projects were like shady guys. Who would not be getting approval from a normal bank. So on the one hand, they were building up places like Las Vegas and so on, and there was mobbed up money involved and all that. On the other hand, makes a lot of fucking money. So Hoffa's case was always like, you know, you say I'm just personally directing all of these bad decisions, but like my union members haven't lost a dime.
Yeah.
They've gained a lot from my crazy. At one point, there's an account that Hoffa was like giving a speech at a conference of like academics on like labor relations, and then all of a sudden, you know, one of his flunkies like runs up with a phone. It's like, Mr. Hoffa, you have to take this call. And he just takes a call on stage and starts like yelling at the guy about whether to approve a loan or not. He's like, wait, what's the return on investment here?
Amazing.
What's the grass? How much is he putting up? And then like hangs up the phone. So like a lot of the decisions were like personally done by Hoffa.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately how some of it just gets like hung around his neck.
Yeah. Right, because they can say you are the master of this, so if there was any corruption, it's on you.
Yeah. And also they saw fit to kind of recharacterize this nonpartisan employer-employee board that's in the charge of the Central States Pension Fund as basically just like a room full of yes men and then Hoffa telling them what to do. Which if Hoffa, you know, exercised its pull, like that would probably be the case, but I don't think he managed like every decision at all.
Interesting.
But as all this is going on, he is getting investigated and indicted nonstop. That started with the McClellan Committee. I mean, we saw in the last episode how even in as early as the early 50s, Harold Gibbons, who it was completely clean, was getting investigated and grand jury indictments were being thrown against him with the McClellan Committee. And then later when Kennedy gets elected and puts Robert F. Kennedy in charge of the Justice Department, they form a squad called the Get Hoffa Squad of about a dozen lawyers and a much larger army of Department of Justice investigators and FBI agents that are personally detailed to their cases.
And can JFK authorize this during?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he knew full well what was going on, that there was a Get Hoffa Squad, that's in quotes, at the Justice Department. And I think it's important to take a little bit of a side for, you know, a real character. Like, in my opinion, the character, much more so than Robert F. Kennedy himself on the Get Hoffa Squad, which is a guy named Walter Sheridan. Walter Sheridan is like the spooky, like athletically built, like gray-eyed, soft-spoken villain of this whole squad. I don't think there's any other way to characterize him. He's, even at this point, having read a lot about him and having read through interviews with him, he's still like pretty much a mystery to me. But we can say a few things about him. He worked for the Office of Naval Intelligence in World War II, doing like cryptographic transmissions and also like what appears to have been like spy catching stuff for the ONI during World War II and just afterwards. Then he went to the FBI, Hoover's FBI, where they put him on, again, basically Red Squad stuff. He was renowned at the time within the FBI for being able to turn people into informants, to exercise leverage on them, whether that was like them being personally friendly with him or blackmail or the threat of indictment, and squeezing these people and turning them basically into his pawns. And even at the FBI at the time, when, you know, like I think they were estimating like a third of the existing Communist Party was like FBI informants. They were even then were surprised at how well Walter Sheridan managed to turn these guys into his willing informants, feeding him back information all the time. He said he left the FBI because like they weren't focusing enough on mob stuff, which seems to have been like the refrain of
thing a lot of those people say.
Yeah, but that doesn't really track with what Walter Sheridan does next, which is he, after saying like, I'm leaving the FBI's red squad because I don't think Hoover's focusing enough on the mob. He then, with glowing marks from the FBI, goes to the National Security Agency and works in their Office of Security, which is trying to be a spy catcher at the National Security Agency. He also maintains loads of contacts with like fellow NSA people, because at this time it's an absolutely like secretive existence, not admitted agency. Yeah. I mean, pretty much like even through like told James Bamford's The Puzzle Palace, it's barely noticed.
Yeah.
So he works in their Office of Security, essentially investigating members of the NSA and turning people into informants in the NSA for 3 years. Partly working on, like we can imagine, Soviet penetration. Right. And while he's still working with the NSA, he gets reached out to see if he'll come on as a McClellan Committee investigator, working for RFK directly. And this is where, the real privacy be damned, trust in people be damned, like, trust in society be damned, or like constitutional rights be damned. All those aspects of like, got to catch the communists, counter-espionage are brought over to just investigating a labor leader.
So they bring in an NSA agent.
Yeah, I mean, he's like a master spook.
Yeah, that's wild.
So he employs a lot of counterintelligence tactics that he learned in the FBI and in the NSA and in the ONI to the end of getting Hoffa. And he saw Hoffa as like a personally evil enemy. Sheridan at one point had an audience of Tennessee lawyers who were kind of like welcoming him to town. Even though he wasn't a lawyer, he was kind of seen like in the company of lawyers a lot. He was a law school dropout himself. But he told them, quote, throw away your ethics books until Hoffa's in prison. Sheridan, as William Tabak says, the truth is like the tactics that Sheridan used against Hoffa were used once against communist, radical trade unionists, and Reds of all stripes, but the massive escalation in legal warfare, where they're really bringing to bear armies of spies, walls of wiretaps, and so on. It really happens because Hoffa, for once, is like the first opponent that a guy like Sheridan's run across, who has money of his own and a complete willingness to fight back.
Yeah.
There's one of...
Need the titular lawyers, guns, and money.
Yeah. Yeah, he's got them all.
Yeah. And
in this battle, it's interesting because like one of Hoffa's like former supporters, when he was interviewed, he's like 80 something when he's interviewed. It's like, yeah, the FBI were tapping us, so we thought, we should tap them back. So we tapped the FBI.
Amazing.
It's these guys like, dressed up like phone repairmen going to the FBI office, just tapping the FBI and find out what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Live by the sword.
Yeah.
So Hoffa gets, frankly, like, it's hard for historians to keep track of the number of investigations and indictments that were thrown against him, just between 1955 and 1965, these 10 years. The consensus seems to be about a dozen times a prosecutor got a grand jury to indict Hoffa, and that on 5 of these occasions, these indictments survived long enough to not be dismissed for a lack of evidence or for illegal tactics, and dismissed by a judge in federal court. And one of those trials was tried twice after Hoffa got a hung jury. But we'll start out in 1957. So at this time, Hoffa's not even president of the Teamsters Union as a whole yet. But I think it's an important case because it's the first real taste of like the sting versus sting aspects of this, where Hoffa has his own guys, his own wiremen wiring things up, his own spies, and Sheridan and his gang are running their own people. And the thing about this spy aspect is that people need to understand is that the goal of someone like Sheridan is not necessarily like, I'm going to put someone in there until they honestly report something illegal. It's how can I put someone in such a close position at such a time that I can say that something illegal was said to them, or construct out of their presence, in Hoffa's presence, that something illegal occurred. A spy in a close and confidential and trusted position gives a prosecutor the option. It's like David Greenglass on the Rosenberg case. It gives them the option of saying, yeah, I mean, I was with him on this day and he told me that he did this crime. And if you have leverage on that person, you can turn them into a perjurer. That's not to say all of it's perjury, but you can begin to manufacture cases much more easily if you have those files. Or if you have those recordings, if you're tapping, you can bring up which recordings you want to and dump the ones you don't. So with this 1957 case, the McClellan Committee is still in session. Robert F. Kennedy is their chief counsel and Walter Sheridan is his main dude. The allegation here was pretty simple. Hoffa was, and this is how the allegation goes, was approached by an attorney named John Cy Chasty. I know it says Chasty, but that's apparently how you say it, is Chasty. Chasty. And Chasty, by his own account, was a simple New York lawyer who was recruited by one of Hoffa's other lawyers. And the assignment that Hoffa's lawyer gave Chasty, according to Chasty, was to infiltrate the McClellan Committee on labor racketeering and spy in the McClellan Committee for Hoffa. Like in American tabloid.
Yeah, pretty much straight up.
Yeah. Chasty then turned to the FBI and said, oh my God, I don't know what happened. I've been recruited by Hoffa to spy on the McClellan Committee. This could put my bar card and everything in danger. What do I do? And so the FBI set up a sting operation where Chasty says that he would give McClellan Committee secret documents to Jimmy Hoffa, like Jimmy Hoffa personally, in exchange for $2,000. So just, I've got the documents, hand them over, $2,000. The FBI actually arranged this meetup in their own account, and then Hoffa was, photographed getting a file of documents and handing over $2,000. Seems like a pretty straight up case, right? Yeah. Hoffa's account was very different. Hoffa, in his defense, claimed that Chasty offered to help counsel witnesses before the committee and then report back what those witnesses were saying. The smoking gun, like cash for committee documents meeting, was, Hoffa thought, just a handoff by Chasty of legal papers and memoranda about these witnesses that he prepared for Hoffa in exchange for a duly agreed upon legal fee of $2,000. So Hoffa turned to his kind of hired gun in the courtroom on this case, Edward Bennett Williams, the guy. Yeah. And as I said before, literally one of the greatest trial lawyers in history. Robert F. Kennedy claimed... Also
one of the great trial lawyers, right?
No.
Oh.
RFK doesn't try any of these cases. No shit.
I kind of assumed.
Yeah. So yeah, RFK tried none of these cases. He assigned probably like the best and the brightest DC prosecutor he could find. I forgot his name. But this was not that hard a case to beat. Hoffa literally took the stand in his own defense in this case. And generally speaking, that's not something you want to do, even when your client is flat out innocent, because they might say the wrong thing to give the jury the wrong impression, and then they end up in prison. Yeah. Walter Sheridan, for his part, blamed the verdict basically on Black people. This was a DC jury, and so it had a lot of African Americans. Yeah. And in the middle of the trial, Joe Louis, like world champion boxer Joe Louis, comes in and shakes hands with Jimmy Hoffa. And Hoffa maintains that it was because like Joe Louis is a friend of mine. Yeah. And Sheridan, tried to press the case and I think leaked to the press like multiple times that Joe Louis had clearly been paid to influence the jury because, in his opinion, an African-American jury in DC, just upon seeing that world champion Joe Louis, would just be like, well, if Joe Louis thinks
then obviously he's okay.
Yeah, I'm not going to consider these evidence at all. It's Joe Louis's friend. Yeah. No, Joe Louis apparently was like dating Hoffa's like co-counsel at the time, who was an African-American woman.
Interesting.
Yeah. So this case was honestly not that hard to beat because basically just Chasty says Hoffa's people came to me and hired me. Hoffa says, seems like Chasty came to us. And it was like basically a sting from the beginning that Chasty was trying to set Hoffa up and say, I'm going to give you some legal papers and then later on that would be presented as I'm giving McClellan committee papers.
Yeah.
As Hoffa's still being like called up to testify before the McClellan committee, they're still grilling him at this time. So I found weirdly one development on this case in perspective that has not been commented on in any books, which is Chasty himself was a spook.
Yeah.
Chasty, the like goody two shoes New York lawyer who got wrapped up with Hoffa and says he went to the FBI. Wrong. Chasty works for the CIA.
Oh.
So in Chasty's obituary,
Oh, wow.
says after he retired at 87 in 1994, he told his family that in the 60s and 70s, he had been a contract employee of the Central Intelligence Agency. The obituary also noted his ties as a New York lawyer to relatives and, by extension, also did some business for Murder Inc. head Albert Anastasia. Who was assassinated the year after this trial. So I'm not saying that Chasty like was a CIA like flunky at the time of this trial.
That Langley like loaned them a guy.
Yeah,
It's not that.
No, I just think that there's good reason to believe that he was a mob-connected wannabe spy, a contractor, if you will, who liked espionage and simply like kept going post-World War II. And he was planted in Hoffa's camp, because otherwise, frankly, it's hard to make sense of this guy's actions or his life. And also, you know, as we talked about in our patron-only episode, I know, Underworld Theory, it's not just an underworld of people who want to be and offer themselves up as intelligence assets. It's not just, you know, surly, you know, gun-toting guys. It's also lawyers.
Yeah.
It's also people like Chasey who like want to be spy, want to pretend they're James Bond,
right?
You know? And apparently, you know, kind of was, if he was working through the 60s and the 70s for the CIA as a contract agent. I mean, who knows what he was doing?
Yeah.
Which brings us to 57 and 58.
Trial number 2.
Trial 2.
Ding.
The wiretap case. And this is something I wanted your opinion on because you just read a book about wiremen, right, Peter?
Yeah. I read The Enchanters.
The new Elroy.
Yeah, the new Elroy. I mean, you know, we have had some discussion about talking a little bit less about James Elroy and Mike.
I'm suspending the rule.
But we're suspending the rule. I read his latest novel, The Enchanters. It's a late era Elroy novel, which means that it's the kind of thing you will like if it is the kind of thing you will like, but you probably won't like it as much as Underworld USA.
Yeah.
That's kind of seems to be the general consensus of Elroy heads, that his new novels are admirable, but not quite the same. And I agree with that, though I do think that there's more going on that a strict, like, why isn't he doing more politics, read ignores. And you could read about that in my newsletter, Melendi Avenue Review.
Nice pitch.
Yeah, hell yeah, that's what I like.
But yeah, the
plot actually starts with Hoffa.
Yeah.
The plot starts with Jimmy Hoffa contracting real life underworld character Freddie Otash, former Marine, former LA cop, local boy, Boston boy, go out to the West Coast, maybe not Boston, but Massachusetts.
Close enough.
I think North Shore. Yeah. But goes out, Lebanese American, goes out. He's a little cop for a little bit, but then he becomes private eye to the stars, shakedown artist, blackmailer, collector of dirt for tabloids like Confidential, a real Elrovian character.
Yeah.
He's written a couple of novels now from the Otash perspective. Hoffa is hiring Otash to wire up some pads and catch the Kennedy brothers doing dirt, including doing the dirty to Marilyn Monroe, who winds up being kind of the center of the novel in many ways, though not in ways you might expect. Again, see Melendi Avenue Review.
Yeah, but that's a wireman, a guy who is a specialist in these electronic surveillance techniques, which include two very different things: bugging, which is you insert electronic, usually a radio controlled device at this time. And at this time, the bugs are getting like smaller and smaller as time goes on, the 50s into the 60s. but they have to have like a little transistor in them. And you have to listen to them with a certain range. So there's like guy who has to be in a car with the wheels turning.
Or you have to secure some real estate nearby.
Yeah.
You need a power source.
Yeah, or you leave a recorder in a nearby place and you hope it works.
Yeah, there's lots of ins and outs, and of course Elroy loves that stuff. So.
Whereas that wiretapping is basically you implant a split line either directly into someone's phone or on the nearby telephone line that runs to their house. And this case, this second trial of Jimmy Hoffa, is kind of about both, because it's illegal to do those things in many states.
Yes.
Actually, all states at the time. So in this case, it started in 1957, and Hoffa was charged with, ironically, attempting to plant telephone taps on members of Local 299 to monitor them. And I say ironically because Hoffa was, of course, being tapped like pretty much everywhere he went. In Local 299, like if he was tapping those phones, he literally would have to like remove bugs and put his own bugs in.
And 299, was that the really crooked one in New Jersey?
No. 299 was Hoffa's own local in Detroit.
Yes, that's right. I lose track of them.
Partly crooked for other reasons. Yeah, you're thinking of Local 560.
Yes.
Tony Provenzano. But he was charged with attempting to do these telephone taps, and Owen Burt Brennan, who's one of like Hoffa's day ones from all the way back in episode 2, or episode 1 rather, also Local 299, was charged. And these were alleged to have happened in 1953. And the case got its start from like a whole other line where the McClellan Committee, RFK being counsel, was questioning Jimmy Hoffa. And supposedly Hoffa and his local bought something from New York racketeer Johnny Dio. We talked about in the last episode, had set up all these like paper fake locals that helped out Hoffa get elected. The something that Hoffa supposedly bought was supposed to be bugs, which were called mini phones, MINIPHONS. But it led the investigators to look further into whether Hoffa did other wiretapping type activities, and led them to a guy named Bernard Spindell. Now, Bernard Spindell was a very public figure at the time. He was the leading expert everyone would talk about, including the media, on wiretapping. He was like the consummate wireman, hired by Hoffa via Johnny Dio to come over and bring the mini phone bugs to Hoffa. At least that was the charge. I have a little quote from Bernard Spindell,
who's also a character in The Enchanters. They use his name as, if I remember right, they use his name as, the character. Right?
He just is historic character.
Yeah, much like Otash or whoever else as the guy that they sent along to help wire up Marilyn Monroe's apartment.
Yeah, because at the time, he was like literally considered just the best guy to do any type of wiretapping. He says, "I'm a wiretapper. I'm also an electronic eavesdropper. I practice an art which has progressed so far in the last 10 years that few people, if any, are entirely safe from the prying ears of snoopers like me."
I wonder if he partially inspired like Gene Hackman in the conversation or whatever.
I think that's absolutely the case. He put out a book which is well out of print now, where he kind of, as a reflective intellectual, is thinking about the implications of his job as a wiretapper and how it's just getting better and better and better and easier to do. And he sees it as essentially like the electronics that surround us in the world have actually penetrated within so much that no one is safe from anyone. And the walls that previously kept out government and private companies and, nosy neighbors and so on are eroding away in a way that is impossible to ignore. And one would think, I guess, the only way to stop them is the law and prosecution and the regulation, basically. The reason for Spindell being hired is obvious. He was the best known wireman. So in 1955, as Hoffa was being periodically grilled by the McClellan Committee, Spindell actually came by Congress as an expert in hearings on wiretapping electronic surveillance. He actually showed all these congressmen various wiretapping devices, and they ate that shit up.
Oh, I believe it. Yeah, they love props.
So cool. But this case was interesting. So the allegation and the evidence was that a former New York state trooper, and pay attention to this one, audience, state trooper and former state trooper is going to be a pattern with all of the trials that follow here.
Yeah, they were the state troopers are famously, we might have talked about this of the peak skill thing, but they're famously reactionary even by cop standards. Founded to be kind of go-to guys for strike breaking and modeled after European cavalry, which did the same thing in Europe, the aristocratic branch.
Yeah, they're modeled after gendarmes, right? And they're militarily trained and militarily disciplined, which has an effect on who joins the state police versus who joins like their local police department.
You like going to work every day looking like dressed like you got to invade Poland?
But yes, former New York state trooper, and who knows, maybe he was at the Peak Skull riot, Rudolph Dulacki, said that on July 6th to July 10th of 1953, he was at Hoffa's own local 299 at the Union Hall to hook up the wires with Bernard Spindell there. And what's more, Hoffa came in and said, oh, like, this is how you're doing it. Oh, good. The taps are in. Like, basically inspected to see that everything was being done well. And, you know, Hoffa, like, did a lot personally, but also this would seem to be kind of stupid because if you have Bernard Spindell there, like, why do you have the state trooper?
Yeah. What good is he just there to like help staple like the things into the wall, like break down the drywall or whatever? Like, come on,
the greatest expert, and then like a schmuck, like
and like was Hoffa in the habit of hiring cops to do stuff?
Not
really. I mean, I figured maybe it was some. I mean, most. I
mean, he did bring on cops for some things. It's mostly his lawyers who brought on cops.
Yeah.
But that becomes a repeated problem here is, you know, if you didn't have these cops around, you wouldn't have any problems.
And he has his own guys. Like he has his own goons.
And the truth is, like, one thing that comes out of like any of the Hoffa autobiographies, whether it's like the Trials of Jimmy Hoffa or the Hoffa in his own words, is that Hoffa loves unionizing cops and he feels for their plight as working class people.
I'm not saying,
but Hoffa also fucking hates cops.
I'm not saying he's like a fucking abolish the police guy. I'm just saying that it seems unlikely he would hire cops to do sensitive stuff like that when he already has people with most of the skills who are loyal to him.
Yeah, he basically sees cops instinctively as like a potential enemy. So this story is a little weird from the beginning. But Hoffa's defense was complete denial and alibi. In other words, you say I was there when you wired this thing up. Actually, I wasn't. Hoffa maintained that he hired Spindell, Bernard Spindell, to check his offices for bugs in electronic taps because he believed he was being monitored and surreptitiously tapped by authorities. I mean, true.
So was this also done in the DC courts?
No, this was done up in Michigan.
I see.
Yeah.
And so the Get Hoffa squad operating out of the Department of Justice is feeding these cases to state governments.
That's exactly right.
Gotcha.
Right. It is a network with the hub in DC.
Yes.
So Hoffa also explained that he could not have been in the office on July 9th to see Dulacki and Spindell put taps into the phones because he was at a Teamsters convention in Seattle that day. And the alibi was backed up by a slew of witnesses, like almost 24 witnesses, to the point where the prosecution had to concede he was in Seattle. In other words, these weren't like just like obvious paid witnesses or whatever. Like they seemed like credible people who were just there at the Teamsters convention in Seattle and saw Hoffa there. So the prosecution midway through the trial was forced to just admit, okay, Hoffa was in Seattle on July 9th, but our state trooper witness is not lying because maybe he could have flown back in time.
Okay, yeah.
And maybe our own witness was mistaken about the time of day that these taps were put in the phone.
And you also kind of would have figured that the Get Hoffa people would have gotten their ducks more in a row before going ahead with this. So I guess any kind of trial is also just such an inconvenience.
Yeah.
Right. That's kind of the principle behind the concept of lawfare, right? It's just inconvenient and expensive, and it gets you get associated with bad press.
Yeah. And I mean, each trial like is also supposed to exactly like wear down the image of Hoffa as a working man guy, instead make him into a creepy wiretapping guy. But yeah, that doesn't work here. He's acquitted.
Yeah.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Y'all got to feel him.
Done. Interestingly, as kind of a preview of future trials, a juror comes forward right after this trial saying that a labor reporter attempted to contact her during the trial, like how did he get the juror's name and so on. And that raised the specter of jury tampering by Hoffa. I really don't believe that Hoffa tampered with this jury. I find that very hard to believe because his defense in this case is so strong. The prosecution literally rests on, if you break it down, just the testimony of one guy who may have been employed by them. Like, we don't really know. And it's a solid alibi. Like, that's a walk.
Use something like a mine detector to trace the wire. Goes to the room over the garage next door. Well, it's nice to know who your good neighbors are. The radio did the trick. They're deep and they can't hear a word. Who's they? Police. You sure that's the only bug in my house? You sure that's the only bug in my house? What I have in mind is a very worthy cause. We're going to help the police department. Even the police aren't allowed to tap private wires. That's why we're going to do it for them. Here's 500. There'll be another 5 if you do a good job.
So in between, like, so after trial number 2 that we're at here now, Hoffa has the formal conference on transportation unity, which we spoke about earlier. He invited the ILW guys, Harry Bridges people, the leaders of the ILA, the hyper-blacklisted National Maritime Union, which had its own communist membership and had its own officers repeatedly prosecuted for alleged Soviet ties and alleged espionage. And those guys actually were represented by a guy named Lee Pressman, who was himself accused of being a communist fellow traveler and was actually a friend of Alger Hiss.
Oh, wow.
So Hoffa is like, no, I love these people. Like, let's unite transportation. Leading up to the conference, Hoffa likened the power, and I love this, Hoffa likened the power to shut down transportation in a national transportation strike to a, quote, atomic bomb.
Oh, wow.
Which he said shouldn't be used.
Right. You need it as a deterrent.
Yeah. Hoffa believes in deterrence.
So I wonder, in that metaphor, what's second strike capacity? Because on the one hand, you want second strike capacity in order to win wars, but you also don't want to develop it because then the other side will use its atomic bombs on you before you develop second strike, or else you have to develop it really, really fast. Nuclear strategy is closer to theology than anything else. But
true. So Hoffa simultaneously had this going along with a thrust towards global transportation unity, where he was trying to bring in maritime and transportation unions from as far away as England and France and Italy and so on, using Harold Gibbons and Edward Chaffetz, both former communists, as his face, as his diplomats, as it were, going abroad. This prompted a special emergency McClellan Committee report of heightened urgency called, quote, Alliance of Certain Racketeer and Communist-Dominated Unions as a Threat to National Security. They saw this conference on transportation unity and this linking up of Hoffa with these forces essentially is something like a fifth column threat in the event of a war. At least they tried to hype it up that way, because they were, I think, unquestionably, regardless of whether there was like a war with the Soviet Union or China or something like that, they were scared about the ability of this group of people to extract concessions economy-wide. Frankly, had the transportation unity thing gone through, I think we would be looking at a very different United States today.
Oh, yeah.
This all brings us, though, Hoffa at the height of his power, and now RFK and the Get Hoffa squad are officially on the case.
Mhm.
These previous trials have been kind of like duds. They weren't well coordinated, but there was no Get Hoffa squad at the DOJ with millions of dollars at its disposal, unlimited transportation budgets, unlimited FBI budgets, and so on. The first test of that is in October of 1962 with trial number 3, the test fleet case. This is also referred to as the Nashville trial because it happens in Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville, Tennessee being chosen as the forum, as they say in this case, the court where the case is indicted and tried, was very much suspected, and I think it's kind of obvious that at this point, the Kennedys, they tried cases in D.C. before a mostly black jury, tried cases in Michigan before a jury full of, union members, union backers, and also African Americans suspicious of this case against Jimmy Hoffa. And now they want a more sympathetic audience. Now, they're not going to try to go all the way to the Jim Crow South and open themselves up for charges that they're just trying to rig a
the
bullshit
upper
jury.
South, Nashville, the town too city to hate.
Yeah.
Which I think Atlanta also called itself.
Yeah. Both I think call themselves that.
Yeah.
Al Gore senior country. Yeah. So this case was a misdemeanor. It was a federally charged misdemeanor. This is like the most expensive misdemeanor fucking case that's ever been tried. I repeat, it was a misdemeanor.
Is it actually officially the most expensive misdemeanor?
It might be. As far as federal cases, honestly, this might be the most expensive misdemeanor trial ever tried, particularly if you throw in the follow-up case, the Chattanooga trial.
Right, yeah.
This case also appears to have been a trap. And to kind of pull back for a second, the strange thing about this trial and the follow-up trial is it's kind of like all the rules of legal decorum are being observed, right? But the machinery underneath is actually what's driving the show. And that machinery underneath is just a layer of spies and wiretaps and recordings and basically pressured and intimidated witnesses, all going from the government to Hoffa, not really going the other way. And the ironic part is that this case, this test fleet trial, it's a misdemeanor, and a little bit of a spoiler, Hoffa gets a mistrial out of it. The jury split, but the allegation for his next trial is that he tampered with the jury of the test fleet trial. So these are two connected trials, one of which is this bullshit misdemeanor case, and we'll talk about it. And the other is the much more serious felony allegation of jury tampering on the much more serious allegation of tampering with the jury of this misdemeanor case. That allegation of jury tampering is a felony that, if convicted, would necessarily mean that Hoffa, under the rules of the union, can't be the head of the union anymore.
So they must have felt reasonably confident that he would commit some offense like this.
Yeah.
Over the course of this this misdemeanor trial.
Yeah, and by commit the offense, I mean did everything to make that or the appearance of that happen. Because this trial was basically a sting that looked like a trial.
Do we have like testimony to that from any of the people involved? Like, is that something they admit to?
So there's bits and pieces that are admitted to, and William Tabak in his book Rise and Fall of Tommy Osborne has been really good, and also he got a hold of grand jury testimony on it. His book was very good at finding people afterwards, including the lead prosecutors too, who admitted that they did things that were illegal. No one just out and out said, oh yeah, like we didn't think we'd win the test fleet trial, like we didn't really care if we won the test fleet trial, because it was actually all just a sting to get Hoffa for jury tampering. And it's entirely possible that these prosecutors involved in the test fleet case really just wanted to hit Hoffa with everything, and that Walter Sheridan took this as an opportunity to create the witnesses, as it were, to manufacture the witnesses who will be later used for the jury tampering trial.
Okay.
No, it's confusing, but that is the thing here, is that this trial was kind of just a trap that Hoffa and his lawyers walked into. It's hard to see how they would walk out. To talk about the test fleet case itself, first, it's important to note that this crime that's being charged is a violation of the much hated Taft-Hartley Act. This is probably the most hated piece of legislation in American labor history, We talked about it already. It prohibits secondary boycotts, sympathy strikes, political strikes. It's bad. But this part of the Taft Hartley Act isn't so bad, except for the potential ammunition that it gives a prosecutor. And that's how these laws really function, especially for a federal prosecutor, is they're just ammunition to construct a case on. It's very postmodern. Hoffa has his own hired gun for this trial, and really one that is as respectable, at least in Tennessee, as, anyone from Edward Bennett Williams' firm. And that is this guy, Z.T. Tommy Osborne. He fought a case called Baker versus Carr, which is legendary in the Supreme Court jurisprudence. It shapes everything about how people are representing the United States today. Prior to Baker versus Carr and Tommy Osborne's suit that brought this about, individual states like Tennessee or Texas or New York could have their districts shaped and grouped with as many or as few people as they wanted to. So you could have like the Tennessee Senate with 20 districts that represent all of 200 people and maybe just a bunch of cows. But that they're the majority over places like Nashville and Memphis that have a lot more people. And this was, of course, very much used by Jim Crow states to just district out.
And you could see how they would get there, because they could say, well, the United States, we do the same thing. Right. These districts are the same as the states of the United States, right? They represent these. I always wondered at the logic of bicameral state legislators, because, like, okay, in Britain, you have two houses because they're originally two different estates of the realm, the aristocracy and the commons. Then in the US Constitution, you have two houses because one of them is supposed to represent that this country is an alliance of states, or was circa 1787.
Yeah, and not to get too far off track, like they were, these states were able to point at the United States Senate and say, that's not a one person, one vote place. Wyoming, population 600,000, has the same votes as population of California, population like 35, 40 million. Which makes their votes count less.
Right, but at least there was at one point a pretense that the different states really were states. Whereas what's the pretense? Like, no one thinks the counties, maybe in some states, but nobody thinks that like the counties of Massachusetts are like these semi-independent, like what? Like I just don't get it. Like
it's the pretext of power, right? It allows a legislator to be in there wielding power, wielding committee appointments with the votes of like 300 people, whereas someone in Nashville has to get the vote of like 30,000, right? And Tommy Osborne brought a suit before Judge Miller in the Nashville court, who ultimately is the judge on the Hoffa test fleet trial. And that lawsuit goes all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and the halo on top of them, Warren Court at the time, said, this doesn't make sense that these, cowpoke, bumfuck districts are getting the same amount of legislators as much larger urban populations. Instead, state districts should have approximately equal populations. And unfortunately, we don't have the United States with the Senate, which explains a lot of the conservative politics of the country. But Tommy Osborne wanted the state. So you have one person, one vote at the state level because of Tommy Osborne. He was also chair of the Bar Association in Nashville, and literally the most aggressive young lawyer anyone could find in Nashville. Pretty like gray bar. He immediately objected to something that happened at the very beginning of this test fleet trial, which is the potential jury list barely included any women or Black people. And we're about to talk about why that is. We should probably talk about first, though, what the allegations were in the test fleet case. What did they say Hoffa did? And I will be first to say that there is like something to the test fleet allegations. It's not as much as commentators, including in Jacobin magazine, have said, following the lead of
calling you out, Jack.
They kind of followed the lead of Dan Mulday on this without citing anything real. Dan Mulday is the Hoffa Wars. So Hoffa in the test fleet case is charged with soliciting, accepting payments from a car moving company, a trucking company that moves cars, that the Teamsters organized, called commercial carriers. And they supposedly made these payments through a sort of dummy pass-through company, a phony company that was in the names of Hoffa's wife, as well as the wife of his friend and day one homie Owen Burt Brennan. In return, Hoffa supposedly guaranteed commercial carriers labor peace, meaning, hey, you're giving me a cut of your profits. I won't ever authorize a strike against commercial carriers. That was the premise of the test fleet case. In other words, Hoffa had commercial carriers pay him off in order that the drivers for commercial carriers wouldn't go on strike. This all happened like in the late 40s, early 50s, the allegation. The test fleet trial is happening in 62, but they say that the offense was going on as long as Hoffa still had this dummy company operating in his wife's name, Josephine Hoffa. That dummy company was called Test Fleet, hence the Test Fleet trial.
Not that they were testing what
Yeah.
they were doing, even though arguably maybe they were.
Yeah, kind of they were, right? So the setting here, as I said, is important. Bobby Kennedy's Get Hoffa squad went to Tennessee because they thought it was the best venue because it's a soft apartheid, rough justice type state.
Yeah.
But not so deep in the South as to raise eyebrows of liberals back home. He could ensure that he wouldn't get like the DC type jury that Walter Sheridan said was the reason that they lost the bribery trial and not because it was a stupid case.
Right.
Now, the jury selection system in Tennessee, in this part of Tennessee in particular, was uniquely bad. It was called the keyman system. The keyman system is like a remnant of like old burghers controlling the city, the walled city.
Yeah.
It's basically local notables of unimpeachable reputation select a list of people that they believe to be people of good moral character in the community to be potential jurors on any case. So it's literally like people they know,
right,
and have decided are good enough in the view of like like wealthy people and government officials.
Right, the good burgers.
Yeah, the good burgers of still Jim Crow era Nashville, Tennessee.
Oof, yeah.
So you have a bunch of like basically wealthy white people and white officials, all men. Some of them probably like burning crosses in their spare time.
Right.
Who build lists of people that they trust to run trials as the way that they think trials should be run. And that is the list of potential jurors that the federal court in Nashville is going to like try this case on and try Hoffa on. From the beginning, Tommy Osborne objected that this keyman system is insufficient to represent the community of Nashville. And there's much more litigation on this like after this case, but obviously he was right. And they did bring in basically one black man onto the jury, onto the Hoffa jury. And then, as we'll talk about in just a sec here, Walter Sheridan threw a skate and had him thrown out. So, and I know I mentioned this is a misdemeanor. The maximum sentence on this case was 2 years and $20,000, which for Hoffa is like nothing. Probably be like a suspended sentence. But back to describing what the evidence was in the test fleet case. As I said, this is supposed to be about a payoff for labor peace. So how was the payoff carried out, right? Hoffa and his day one guy, Owen Burt Brennan, they set up a truck leasing company that's nominally in their wife's names called Test Fleet, which they later renamed Hobren, like Hoffa and Brennan. It's not exactly secret here. Side note, Hoffa did this after specifically talking to his lawyer about whether it would be legally permissible to do business with commercial carriers, given that the Teamsters organized them. And his lawyer said, yes. So Test Fleet, this company set up in Hoffa's wife's name, was then supplied with a set of about a half dozen trucks from commercial carriers, as in commercial carriers, the company that the Teamsters organized, gave to Test Fleet, like gratis.
Right, to a company that Hoffa and his friend made.
Yes. Now, Test Fleet then leases those trucks back to commercial carriers. So like, okay, thank you for giving us these trucks. We're going to lease them back to you for your use. And those trucks are then leased out for commercial carriers' most expensive operation, which is taking like new Cadillacs from Detroit out of the factory and then driving them down to places like Tennessee,
Right.
Tennessee being one of those places that commercial carriers took the cars down to, they then become the venue of the test fleet trial. Now, the fun thing about this scheme is that those trucks like literally never left commercial carriers, right? Nor would they have to. The commercial carriers basically transferred the ownership of the trucks to Test Fleet, the company, and then paid Test Fleet for the lease that Test Fleet generously gave to commercial carriers.
Yeah.
So it's just a really just off the top cut.
Yeah.
Like the trucks never changed hands. They still have the same drivers. They never left commercial carriers. Test Fleet basically just exists as like an office and an accountant.
Right. To take this kind of rake off.
Yeah.
And make it look legal or make it look legit.
Yeah. And I mean, here's the thing. Commercial carriers is completely within their rights to do this bullshit payment. As everybody paid taxes on this scheme. Everything was legally filed. Hoffa checked with his lawyers to see.
Taft-Hartley.
Yeah, but Taft-Hartley prohibits a payoff exchange for labor peace of this kind. And Hoffa himself is prohibited from receiving payments of any kind from an employer he organized, like any gifts or anything like that. So he can't set up this company in his own name. It's in his wife's name. So much of the evidence kind of turned on demolishing Hoffa's first line of defense, that this company was set up as a nest egg for his wife in case something should happen to him, and in which neither Hoffa nor his wife really participated in day to day. The prosecutors put in witness after witness and document after document to show a flow of money through a chain of transactions from Test Fleet, this company, to James Hoffa's own assets. And there are 3 examples that they really took a while to put in, but eventually did put in. So they brought into evidence 2 dividend checks. So congratulations on owning your Test Fleet stock, Mrs. Hoffa, your share in the company.
Right.
They're for $5,000 each, issued to Josephine Hoffa, and those were exchanged for 2 cashier's checks amounting to about $9,800 at a bank in Detroit. The cashier's checks, if you're keeping up with this, were then deposited into the account of the McDonald brokerage firm, and then the brokerage firm then immediately bought 8,000 shares of stock in a company, and 7,000 of those shares were then reassigned to James P. Hoffa, Hoffa's son. The inference that they wanted the jury to take from that is that this company wouldn't have done that, cashing out the shares from Josephine Hoffa and then transferring those shares, all these transactions to Jimmy Hoffa's son, unless Jimmy Hoffa, big Jimmy Hoffa, was asking them to. That was somewhat unclear, you know?
Yeah.
Why couldn't it just be like mom says, here you go,
right,
little Jimmy?
Yeah, you're my son.
Yeah. In another instance, they showed that another 2 $5,000 dividend checks for Mrs. Brennan, the other listed owner of Test Fleet, were deposited into a joint checking account that she held with her husband, Owen Burt Brennan. Days later, out of that same checking account, a check was written to purchase $9,900 of stock in equal amounts for Burt Brennan and Jimmy Hoffa. So that's a little bit more. It goes into this joint pile of money, and then 2 days later, an almost equivalent amount of money comes out and buys stuff for Jimmy Hoffa. Looks more like an account that he's using, or a pass-through, as they say. But the most on-point evidence that prosecutors were able to put in showed that proceeds from Test Fleet from that same joint checking account from Owen Brennan were then put into the account of another company that used them to pay Jimmy and Josephine's joint taxes for 1 year.
Okay.
So money goes into Burt Brennan's joint checking account with his wife, and then it comes out, goes to another company, and then that company pays Hoffa's taxes.
Okay.
But the defense still has an argument here, which is basically like a shrug.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, so money from my wife's company and my own money got commingled. And my money from Burt Brennan's wife's company and his money got commingled. Like, we're married. What do you want?
Right, yeah.
So what?
You can't charge a husband and wife for the same crime. Sorry, that's from Arrested Development.
The second real set of evidence came from commercial carriers, like the company itself, because the real issue here is quid pro quo. Namely, like, did commercial carriers like pay this money to Test Fleet? But like, did they do it in exchange for labor peace, or just because they like Test Fleet?
Right.
And the head of commercial carriers, Ben Brevoort, said that in the midst of a strike in 1948, he met with Hoffa twice. And Hoffa said basically, I can solve your labor problem. And he did by unionizing commercial carriers.
Yes.
After he consulted with this and consulted with a person Hoffa told him to consult with. And then after that second meeting, he had him meet up with, or had him propose to him doing business with Test Fleet, his new company.
Yeah.
Or his lawyer proposed that he do business with Test Fleet, his new company. So it's like kind of, I mean, the jury deadlocked on this. They had 7 jurors vote not guilty, 5 vote guilty. The result, when you have that kind of a deadlock that they can't work past, is a mistrial. It gives the prosecutor an opportunity to try the case again. And in Test Fleet, they did not do that because they got a much, much juicier thing out of this trial.
Got it.
Which is, during the trial, not only did the prosecution have a spy planted in Hoffa's defense camp, they also had multiple jury tampering allegations happen during the trial. So 3 jury tampering allegations occurred during the course of the case. And the collective impression these allegations left, particularly on the judge, was that if Hoffa wasn't convicted, these 7 people voted for acquittal, it must have been because, you know, we found a little bit of smoke. There must be fire in that jury. And those jurors may have very well been paid off. The strange part about the tamperings, though, is they all except one occurred before the jurors were seated. So before they were even guaranteed to be on the jury.
Okay.
In other words, 2 of these jury tampering allegations were on people who were not on the jury.
Okay.
In which no guy bribing them could have known would be on the jury. And before we get into that jury tampering trial, maybe some take break.
Yeah.
So we might be taking a longer break than anticipated, as we are both hungry.
Yeah.
But before we do, I wanted to address one more thing on the Test Fleet case and the whole Test Fleet allegations, which is the thing that Jackman got wrong following Legal Damn Day. I did a lot of looking into this because one of the things that kind of like great sins that several people have pointed to, like prospective writers, that Jimmy Hoffa did, is they said that Test Fleet, the company, when commercial carriers went on strike, ran trucks to basically scab on the wildcat strike of the commercial carriers workers. The problem with that is I can find no proof evidence of that at all, and it doesn't seem to make any sense to me.
Where do the allegations come
from? They all seem to stem from Dan Muldane's book, The Hoffa Wars, where he said that explicitly.
Okay, did he cite anyone?
Couldn't find it.
Okay.
Yeah. But the real, like, the skepticism about this allegation should come from the fact that Test Fleet consisted of 6 trucks that were just in the most expensive operation.
Yeah, you can't scab the whole thing with just 6.
That commercial carriers had. Yeah, these trucks, which were never in like a Test Fleet garage or at a Test Fleet lot and had no drivers that worked for Test Fleet. There were no drivers that worked for Test Fleet. They all just, like, they were just leased out. Test Fleet was a leasing corporation that leased the trucks.
Right.
And it seems to really have just functioned as like a payoff mechanism. So I don't see how they could have scabbed on anything, much less the operations of something like commercial carriers. So I think it was just kind of made up.
Yeah.
I was confused. But let's take a big break.
Yeah.
Something about this JFK worship of yours. What about Hoffa and the Teamsters?
That was their brother.